quiet hours of the night, when sleep feels far away and the mind drifts toward forgotten places, we turn to stories, not merely of the past, but of echoes that still linger in the present. Tonight, we walk together into a chapter both sorrowful and haunting, the Ghost Dance and Wounded Knee Massacre. This is not only a tale of battles lost or treaties broken, it is the memory of a people reaching for hope, even as the world around them closed in. It is the sound of prayers turned into silence, and the weight of grief carried forward through generations. Here, history is more than dates and names. It is wound in memory, whispering lessons that remain with us still. And as we unfold this story slowly, with care, I invite you to rest in the rhythm of the words. Allow yourself to listen, to drift, and perhaps to find a quiet reflection in the echoes of the past. This is Void Histories. Stay with us as we begin. The Ghost Dance and Wounded Knee Massacre. Before the noise of rifles echoed across the plains, before treaties written in a foreign tongue carved scars into the earth, there was a world where silence carried its own music. The Lakota Sioux lived in harmony with a land so vast it seemed endless, stretching into the horizon with no beginning and no end. Imagine a sea of grass, tall and swaying, shimmering beneath the touch of the wind. Imagine skies so open and unbroken that they seem to hold eternity itself. In this expanse, the people moved with rhythm, not hurried, not grasping, but attuned to the breath of nature. They believed that every creature, every stone, every river carried a spirit, alive, aware, deserving of respect. Life was not divided into parts, it was a single circle, where humans, animals, and the earth were bound together in sacred balance. In the mornings, children would wake to the sound of drums, or to the quiet songs of their mothers, voices soft as the dawn light. Elders gathered by the fire to pass on stories, not merely as entertainment, but as the lifeblood of memory. Stories of ancestors who had walked these same plains, of spirits that watched from the sky, of lessons whispered from the earth itself. To live was to remember, and to remember was to honor. There was no rush in this remembering, no urgency. The stories stretched like rivers, flowing gently, unbroken, steady. The heart of their existence was the buffalo. These creatures were more than food or shelter. They were kin, teachers, providers of life. Every part of the animal was used, nothing wasted. The hide for warmth, the bones for tools, the meat for sustenance. When the hunt was over, prayers were offered, gratitude spoken. The Lakota did not see themselves as conquerors of nature, but as children of the land, receiving gifts from a generous parent. And so the buffalo, vast in number, moving like thunder across the grass, symbolized abundance, continuity, and sacred connection. Imagine then the nights. The prairie sky unfolded like a dark ocean, each star shimmering with ancient light. Families gathered close around the warmth of fires, listening to voices that rose and fell like wind through trees. Children, their eyes heavy with sleep, drifted into dreams as the stories wove them into the fabric of their people. These nights carried no fear of tomorrow, only the quiet certainty that the land would provide, that the spirits would guide, that life would continue in the circle unbroken. And there was the dance, the heartbeat of the people, feet striking the earth, bodies swaying, voices lifted in chants that reached beyond the visible world. The dances were prayers in motion, connections to the unseen, celebrations of existence. They reminded everyone that they were not alone, that the ancestors watched, that the land listened, that the circle held strong. Each step upon the earth was an act of reverence, each drumbeat a reminder that time was not linear, but circular, eternal. But as the years moved, Subtle changes whispered at the edges of this world. The elders noticed the shifts first: fewer herds, unusual sicknesses, unfamiliar faces at the horizon. Yet in these opening moments, before the shadow fully arrived, the land still breathed in rhythm with the people. There was still laughter among children chasing one another across the prairie. There were still prayers rising like smoke into the twilight sky. There was still a sense of wholeness, even as an unseen storm began to gather beyond the hills. This was the world before conquest, before the weight of another nation pressed down upon the prairies. It was a world where harmony was not a dream, but a lived reality, where the Lakota Sioux could still look to the horizon and believe that the circle would remain unbroken forever. Yet history, like the river, always flows forward, and slowly, quietly, the current was turning. And so, as we linger in this moment of peace, let us listen to the wind moving gently across the grass, for it will soon carry with it new sounds, unfamiliar and heavy, marking the beginning of a long sorrow that would change the circle forever. At first, the changes did not come with thunder. They came quietly, like a distant ripple upon still water, hardly noticed until it reached the shore. The Lakota Sioux, who had lived for generations with the rhythms of the earth, began to sense the arrival of something unfamiliar. On the horizon appeared wagons pulled by horses, carrying families who spoke in tongues that felt jagged and sharp to Lakota ears. At first, they seemed like passing travelers, small in number, fragile even, uncertain in this vast land. The people watched them with cautious curiosity, offering food, sometimes guidance, for it was the way of their tradition to meet strangers with measured respect. But the wagons did not stop passing. They multiplied, stretching like a line of ants across the plains, building not temporary camps, but wooden houses, barns, and fences. Fences. This was new. The Lakota had never known land as something to be cut and divided, measured by string, claimed by one man against another. For them, the earth could not be owned, any more than the sky could be captured in the hand. Yet the settlers hammered their stakes into the soil, drove posts deep, and drew boundaries where none had existed before. Each fence was like a scar across the open prairie, whispering that the land was no longer free. The U.S. government soon followed with its soldiers and its laws. Officials spoke of treaties, agreements written on paper, binding in ink. These documents promised peace, promising land to the Lakota if only they would remain within the limits drawn by lines on a map. But the lines shifted with each new discovery of gold, with each new wave of settlers. What was given one season was taken the next. The elders who signed these papers often did so under duress, or without full understanding of the language written upon them. They trusted words spoken, but those words dissolved like smoke, leaving only betrayal. And with betrayal came hunger. The buffalo herds, once vast as the clouds, began to vanish. Settlers hunted them not with reverence, but with greed, leaving carcasses to rot in the sun, hides piled high for profit. Where once the ground trembled beneath the thunder of hooves, now silence stretched across the plains. Without the buffalo, the Lakota struggled. Hunger gnawed at their children, sorrow pressed upon their mothers, and warriors who once roamed proudly now found themselves powerless before emptiness. In the villages, whispers grew heavier. Parents told stories of the old abundance, while children stared with hollow eyes, unable to imagine such plenty. The people turned to the spirits, to prayers, to the dances that had always carried them through the hardship. But beneath the prayers was an unease, a question that lingered. Why was this balance breaking? And why did the newcomers not see the sacredness of the earth they were dividing? The soldiers did not always come with battle, but their presence itself was a wound. Forts rose where buffalo had once grazed, flags flying high in defiance of the wind. The Lakota understood the message clearly. This was no passing presence. This was permanence. These men in uniform did not see the people of the plains as equals, but as obstacles. And so, the tone of the land shifted. Where once there had been quiet cooperation, now there was suspicion. Where once there had been wary peace, now there was tension, taut as a bowstring drawn too tight. And yet, even in these first years of conflict, there lingered hope. Some believed coexistence was possible, that the strangers could learn to respect the rhythms of the earth, to live without fences, without greed. But hope was fragile, and with each treaty broken, with each buffalo slaughtered, with each child's stomach left empty, the fragile threads began to fray. The elders spoke of a storm approaching, one that could not be stopped by prayers alone. This was how the conflict began, not as an explosion, but as a slow unraveling, a gradual shifting of the horizon, until the people who once felt infinite upon the plains now felt pressed into smaller spaces, tighter corners, narrower futures. The land still stretched wide, but freedom was shrinking, and the circle that had once been whole was being bent into pieces. And so, as night falls over these memories, we leave the Lakota standing at the edge of change, their eyes upon a horizon where strangers build fences and soldiers raise flags. The wind carries unease, the rivers murmur of betrayal, and though the people still sing their songs, they do so with a heaviness that foretells the storms to come. The tension, once only a whisper carried on the wind, began to take form. What had started as fences and treaties soon hardened into battles, and the Lakota Sioux, proud guardians of the plains, found themselves standing at the edge of survival. Their way of life, once wide and unbroken, was being pressed into narrow corners. Families felt the hunger left behind by the slaughtered buffalo, and mothers held children whose eyes had lost their brightness. Yet even in the shadow of despair, the spirit of resistance flickered like a flame refusing to die. It began with small confrontations, a hunting ground disputed, a promise broken, a soldier's command met with defiance. The Lakota, though weary, could not surrender their dignity so easily. They rose not out of hatred, but out of duty, to protect their families, their traditions, and the sacred rhythm of the earth itself. For them, to resist was not simply to fight, it was to remain whole, to honor the ancestors who had walked before, and to preserve the memory of a people who had always belonged to the land. But the battles that came were unlike any the Lakota had ever known. The United States Army brought rifles, cannons, and a determination to expand without end. The clash was uneven, yet the Lakota warriors fought with courage born of desperation. In moments, the balance of power seemed to shift. At the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Lakota, alongside their allies, struck a blow so great that it echoed across the nation. The soldiers, led by General Custer, fell beneath the strength of warriors who knew every hill, every river, every hidden path of the land. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the old balance might return, as if resistance could turn the tide. Yet victory carried with it the weight of consequence. The government responded not with reflection, but with fury. More troops were sent, more weapons carried across the plains, more determination to crush what they now saw as rebellion. For the Lakota, each victory was followed by greater hardship. Each act of defiance answered with harsher reprisals. Villages were burned, camps dismantled, and the slow tightening of control pressed upon every family. And still, the people endured. Even as their numbers thinned, even as hunger deepened, the Lakota held onto their dances, their prayers, their stories. They sang songs of courage by the fires at night, songs that told their children that they were more than what the soldiers believed them to be. They taught them that resistance was not only on the battlefield, but also in remembering who they were, in refusing to let the spirit of the people be erased. But resistance carried sorrow as well. For every warrior who stood bravely, there was a family who mourned, a mother who wept for her son, a child who reached for a father who would not return. The prairie, once a place of abundance, now became a landscape marked by absence. Absence of buffalo, absence of peace, absence of futures that once felt certain. The rivers still flowed, the grasses still swayed, but beneath their beauty lay echoes of gunfire and cries of grief. In these years of resistance, the Lakota walked a path that was both noble and tragic. They refused to bow completely, and yet each act of defiance drew them closer to loss. The wars were not simply battles of weapons, but of worlds colliding, one that sought to own and divide, and one that sought to remain whole and free. As the fires of war dimmed into embers, the Lakota found themselves weary, yet still standing. They had proven their courage, they had defended their dignity, but the cost was immense. The circle of their world had been shaken, its edges cracked, and its harmony disrupted. Still, within their prayers and their dances, a quiet hope remained that somehow, in ways unseen, the balance could yet be restored. And so, as the night deepens in this telling, imagine the warriors returning to their villages, their faces lined with both pride and sorrow. The flames of the firelight flicker against their shadows, the drums beat softly in the distance, and the people gather close, carrying both the weight of loss and the fragile ember of hope. For the wars were not the end, but a passage into new trials, treaties, betrayals, and struggles that would test not only their strength, but the very soul of their people. When the smoke of battle began to fade, one might imagine that peace would follow, that exhaustion on both sides would give way to reconciliation. Yet the silence after war was not peace for the Lakota Sioux. It was instead the silence of something heavier. Promises whispered and then broken, treaties signed and then shattered, lives hemmed in by invisible lines drawn on distant maps. The wars had tested their strength, but what followed tested their endurance in subtler, quieter ways, like a slow erosion that wears down even the strongest stone. The treaties came often, offered as if they were gifts, but each one was a cage disguised as compromise. Officials spoke of friendship, of land reserved forever for the Lakota, of protection guaranteed by the authority of the United States. Yet, forever proved fragile. Whenever new land was desired, whenever gold was discovered in the Black Hills, whenever settlers pressed westward with restless hunger, the boundaries shifted again. What had been promised was taken back, what had been secure became contested, and the ink that once seemed binding faded like dust on the wind. For the Lakota, the breaking of treaties was not only political, it was deeply personal. The land was not just soil or stone, it was memory, it was spirit, it was the circle of life itself. To lose it was to lose more than territory. It was to lose songs, hunting grounds, sacred places where prayers had risen for generations. The Black Hills in particular were not simply hills. They were the heart of the world, a holy center. And when miners, backed by soldiers, intruded upon them, it was as though the very heart of the Lakota people had been pierced. In the reservations, life grew harsh. The buffalo, once abundant, had been nearly eradicated. Where once families could provide for themselves through the great hunts, now they depended upon rations delivered by the government. Rations that were often late, insufficient, or deliberately withheld. Hunger became a constant companion, and with it came sickness, despair, and a deep sense of humiliation. The proud hunters of the plains now found themselves waiting in lines for flour and sugar, their independence stripped away. Generations who had once learned freedom on horseback were now confined, told when they could leave, where they could go, how they must live. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where their hair was cut, their language forbidden, their traditions mocked. To be Lakota was suddenly declared wrong, and the young were taught to forget the songs and stories that had once given them identity. It was a quiet war, a war not of rifles, but of erasure, and its wounds cut deeper than any bullet. The Lakota resisted still, but their resistance now took quieter forms. Some continued to dance in secret, to whisper prayers in their own tongue, to tell the old stories by firelight when no outsiders were near. Others tried to negotiate, to hold the government to its word, to demand justice for the promises broken. Yet justice never came, and each petition was met with more silence, more shifting lines, more disappointment. The circle was bending, and it seemed each year pressed it tighter and tighter. Yet even in these days of restriction, a spark endured. The people turned inward, to their faith, to visions and ceremonies that promised renewal. Out of hunger and despair rose the ghost dance, a prayer in motion, a hope that the world could be made whole again, that the buffalo might return, that the ancestors might rise, that the land could be restored. The dance was not just ritual, it was survival, an act of defiance against despair. To dance was to declare that the people were not yet broken, that the circle, though bent, had not been shattered. But hope has a way of alarming those who fear it. To the soldiers and officials who watched from the outside, the ghost dance was misunderstood, seen not as prayer but as threat. They mistook the swaying bodies, the chanting voices, the rising dust of the dance as preparation for rebellion. Fear clouded their judgment, and in their fear they prepared once again for violence. And so, as this chapter of treaties and betrayals draws to a close, the stage is set for something even darker. The Lakota, weary and hungry, turn to the dance for renewal. The soldiers, suspicious and afraid, ready their weapons. The land holds its breath, as if the prairies themselves sense the weight of what is about to come. And we, drifting through these memories, know that sorrow is near, waiting like a shadow upon the horizon. The winter of 1890 settled cold upon the plains, carrying with it not only snow, but an ache that reached deep into the spirit of the Lakota Sioux. Hunger gnawed at bellies, and grief gnawed at hearts. The buffalo were gone, the land was fractured, and the treaties had left only emptiness. And yet, in this landscape of loss, the ghost dance began to rise. Its rhythm promised renewal. Its songs whispered of a world restored. For those who had lost everything, the dance was not rebellion. It was hope made visible, a fragile prayer wrapped in motion. But to the U.S. military, the dance was a danger. They did not hear the prayers in the songs, nor see the longing in the dancers' eyes. Instead, they saw a threat, an uprising waiting to unfold. Fear is a powerful teacher, and it taught the soldiers to strike before understanding. And so, in the last days of December 1890, the Lakota were surrounded at Wounded Knee Creek. Families gathered there not as an army but as a people, men and women, elders and children, weary from hunger, yet still clinging to the dream the ghost dance carried. What followed was not battle but massacre. When the soldiers opened fire, the earth itself seemed to shudder. Women clutching infants fell into the snow. Elders who had once carried the wisdom of generations lay still, and children, too young to understand the meaning of war, were silenced before they could carry forward their people's songs. The snow turned heavy with sorrow, and the winds carried the cries of a nation undone. It was not just lives that were lost at Wounded Knee. It was futures, dreams, and the fragile thread of continuity between past and tomorrow. For those who survived, the scars were not only on their bodies but deep within their spirits. Mothers carried grief that no words could contain. Fathers bore the shame of being unable to protect their children, and entire villages were left hollow, their songs muted by sorrow. The massacre did not only take lives, it fractured time itself. Where once the circle of life had been unbroken, now there was a tear, a wound that could not be closed. Generations that followed carried the weight of this wound. Children grew up with the absence of grandparents who had fallen at Wounded Knee. Families told stories not of triumph, but of loss. The boarding schools that took young Lakota away deepened the wound further, cutting them off from their language, their songs, their ceremonies. The young were taught to forget who they were, to wear the clothes of strangers, to speak in tongues not their own. Many returned unable to bridge the distance between the world they had been forced into and the one that had been taken from them. These were the lost generations, children raised in silence, caught between erasure and memory, struggling to carry an identity that had been broken but not destroyed. Yet even in this silence, resilience endured. The songs were not entirely forgotten. They lingered like embers beneath the ash. Elders, when they could, whispered the old prayers in secret. Mothers sang lullabies that carried fragments of tradition. The dances continued quietly, sometimes hidden, sometimes disguised, but never fully erased. For even in the heaviest sorrow, the Lakota spirit refused to vanish. The wounds of Wounded Knee were carried forward, not as open cries, but as quiet shadows in the hearts of each new generation. Trauma became inheritance, sorrow became memory, and survival itself became resistance. To exist as Lakota after Wounded Knee was to defy erasure, to live when the world seemed to insist on silence. The pain was heavy, yet so too was the strength required to bear it. And so, as night settles deeper, imagine the plains blanketed in snow, quiet except for the wind. Beneath that silence lies the memory of voices lost, and within the silence, too, lies endurance, the refusal to let sorrow be the final word. For the Lakota, the generations may have been marked by wounds, but within those wounds lived the pulse of survival, and in survival, the whisper of hope. And thus, as we step gently from this chapter of grief, we turn toward reflection. The story of Wounded Knee is not just the story of one winter's day. It is the story of how trauma lingers, how it shapes, how it teaches. And so we prepare to enter the final part of this telling, where memory and lesson entwine, where history becomes reflection, and where the silence of the past asks us to listen, even now. History, when we look back, is not only a collection of dates or battles, it is a river of memory, carrying within it the quiet tears of mothers, the unspoken prayers of fathers, and the silenced laughter of children. The story of the ghost dance and the tragedy of Wounded Knee lingers not just as a tale of the past, but as a wound that breathes still in the present. To remember is to feel the echo of loss, but also the resilience of a people who refuse to disappear. For the Lakota Sioux, the massacre was not the end of their story, though many tried to write it so. It was, instead, a turning, a point where survival became an act of resistance. Each family that remained carried sorrow, yet they also carried the duty to keep memory alive. The songs that were silenced at Wounded Knee were sung again in whispers, then louder in later years, until they could be heard once more in ceremonies that continue even now. In this way, the people endured, like seeds hidden in frozen soil, waiting for the thaw to bring them back to life. When we reflect on this past, it is easy to see only the sorrow, but to pause here is to miss something essential. For within the sorrow lies endurance, within the silence lies memory, within the brokenness lies the choice to remain whole. The Lakota, despite everything, Despite treaties shattered, despite children taken, despite hunger and grief, remained. Their language, though suppressed, still flows through the voices of new generations. Their dances, once forbidden, rise again under open skies. Their prayers, once whispered in secrecy, now stand as testaments of survival. And so, Wounded Knee is not just a site of death, it is also a site of remembrance. Each year, descendants gather there, walking in the footsteps of those who fell, not to relive the pain, but to honor it, to carry forward the truth of what happened, and to remind the world that such wounds must not be forgotten. Memory itself becomes a form of justice, even when justice in the courts or governments fails to arrive. As we close this story, it is important to remember that colonization does not end in a single battle, nor in a single massacre. Its effects ripple outward, across generations, shaping lives in quiet ways, through lost languages, fractured traditions, or the heaviness of trauma carried silently within families. Yet just as trauma can travel through time, so too can resilience, so too can strength. The Lakota Sioux teach us that to endure is itself an act of defiance, and to remember is to resist forgetting. Perhaps, as you listen now, you can imagine the wide prairie beneath the stars, the grasses swaying in the night wind, and the faint sound of drums carried across the distance. The voices of ancestors linger there, reminding us that history is not gone. It rests beneath the surface of the present, waiting for us to pause, to listen, to carry its lessons forward. And what is that lesson? It is that human beings, no matter how wounded, carry within them the ability to heal. It is that even the deepest sorrow can give rise to wisdom. It is that when we look upon the tragedies of the past, we are invited not only to grieve, but also to reflect on how we choose to live now. Whether we build fences or bridges, whether we divide or honor, whether we forget or remember. The ghost dance, though silenced in blood, remains as a symbol of longing, a longing for balance, for return, for a world where the circle is whole again. Perhaps that is why it still haunts us, why its story still matters. For in the end, the dance was never about violence. It was about hope, about believing that even in the darkest winters, renewal is possible. And so, as this long telling draws to a close, let us carry the story gently. Let it rest within you as you drift toward sleep, not as noise, but as a soft echo, a reminder that the past breathes through us. May it remind you that silence holds memory, that sorrow holds wisdom, and that the human spirit, no matter how deeply wounded, always seeks the light of healing. And with that, the story falls quiet, like the plains under moonlight. The wind moves softly through the grass, the stars keep their patient watch, and the circle, though scarred, remains unbroken. Sleep now, and let the memory of the Lakota guide your dreams, whispering that even in the deepest night, the dawn will come again.